12,000 kilometres is a long way. It's about a third of the circumference of the Earth, the same as cycling across the USA and back twice, the same as 4 Tour de France's without a peloton to protect you from the wind. The idea of driving this distance seemed crazy. The idea of cycling through a desert where the road ran out halfway, then over mountain ranges that climbed to 5,000 metres high, through a savannah where lions and leopards roamed freely by the roadside, and into cities where cars were hijacked at gunpoint. This all seemed as far beyond the realms of sanity as it was possible to get. I couldn't wait to get started. Egypt. The adventure began at the Giza pyramids in Cairo on a cold January morning. There were around 30 of us, cyclists from all over the world, nervously waiting to begin pedalling. Bikes were polished, lycra pristine clean, bodies healthy and filled with food, and minds ignorant of the tough times that lay ahead. The rolling desert sand stretched forever into the distance. 3 Toyota pickups drove up the access road to the pyramids. In the back of each were men in balaclavas, holding semi-automatic rifles. The group looked around at each other anxiously. "That's our police escort," said the tour leader, Sharita, a tough South African woman with a casual blonde bob and a t-shirt that said, "Africa is not for sissies." "We'll be going through Cairo city centre, so you need to ride carefully." "Why are they wearing balaclavas?" I whispered to one of the other cyclists. "Maybe because it's cold," he whispered back. Cairo is a sprawling city of slums, skyscrapers, ancient mosques, world-renowned museums, and gargantuan housing developments. Home to over 16 million people and growing by the day. Behind a convoy of police cars and motorcycles, we cycle through all of it, watched over by bemused locals cadging for lifts on the edge of the highway. The city was sprawling into the desert to find room for another 3 million people. It was struggling with necessary infrastructure and affordable housing. Luxury hotels, office blocks, and riverside villas contrasted with derelict apartments, open sewers, and rivers of uncollected trash. The locals were seeing none of the new investment. New Cairo, familiar problems. Soon the police escort left us, the urban sprawl rescinded, and we were alone with the desert. 11,980 kilometres of Africa left to go. The road was a pristine concrete highway, empty aside from the occasional rickety van or cement truck. Our tyres glided over the surface, helped by the presence of a benevolent tailwind. The road had been partially funded by the Chinese, and the motivations became clear as we passed vast quarries of mines, trucks with Mandarin symbols filled with minerals to transport back to the homeland. Our first campsite looked like the kind of place people had taken out to be shot. It was a ravine on the side of the road and had a line of rectangular hollows dug into the sand. It could offer protection from the desert wind, protection from the noise of the highway, or protection from whatever the police were escorting us from. I wasn't sure. It was now time for me to come out to the group about my adventuring inadequacy. In the main, that I had never been camping and had never put up a tent on my own. I laid out a good patch and then slowly started to attach toggles into loops and forced pegs into the hard ground. After half an hour of faffing in the wind, my tent looked like a bin bag attached to a twig. One of the other cyclists came to help me out. Nate was a slim, well-groomed lawyer with blonde hair, glasses, and the physique of a dancer. "Do you want help?" he asked, his voice confident, masculine, Midwest USA. "I hate to say it," I said, "but yes. I thought I had this, but it doesn't seem to be working in the same way as in the back garden at home." Nate crouched and started dexterously threading the tent poles through the grommets. He had a graceful way of moving, like his body was following the lines of a measured ballet. "You mean you didn't camp in this tent yet?" "I mean, I set the tent up in my back garden once to see how it worked, but I've never actually used it in a camping scenario." Nate turned and looked up to me, face half turned in a tell me the fucking truth kind of way. "I have to admit, I'm not much of a camping expert," I conceded. "By not an expert?" "I've never set up a tent before, or been camping properly, ever." Nate nodded, then went back to the tent. In a few moments he had threaded the last of the poles, staked a few pins in the ground, and pulled the tent up. "You know what, Ben? I've never cycled more than 50 miles before, so we can probably help each other out. It's a deal." He gave me a supportive smile. "See you on the road tomorrow." The next morning, we began our first 100-mile ride. I waited for Nate at the start, and we cycled gingerly onto the highway, stiff and sore after our first day on the bikes and our first sleep on the desert sand. The road weaved through the seaside resorts of Hurghada and Safaga, past eerie empty housing developments with Western names such as Santa Claus. It was clear that the decline in the tourist industry had led to the abandonment of many projects, leaving Egypt with little option but to sell off more of its own natural resource. To take our minds off the long cycling day, Nate and I discussed names for our bikes. Whilst most of the cyclists were riding purpose-built touring machines, our bikes were rather more modest in design, and this seemed to engender them with a certain personable character. "Simon," said Nate, "after Simon and Coley." "Who's that?" He was one of South Africa's most important gay and anti-apartheid activists. After years in jail, he organised the first gay and lesbian pride event in the country. He gave a speech where he said, "I cannot be free as a black man if I am not free as a gay man." I think he's a good example of the perseverance required for the trip. And as I'm riding to raise awareness of LGBT rights in Africa, he's a pretty good inspiration. My bike was a 2013 Trek 7.3 FX Hybrid, which, according to the manufacturer, was perfect for commuting and the occasional off-road use. And I was riding for no cause except my own ambitions. "I don't know if I can provide an equally profound moniker," I said. Nate thought to himself for a minute. "The Australian rider Will thinks you look like a little like Prince William, so maybe we can come up with an appropriately regal title." "I'm not sure how happy I'd be about riding a princess every day." "How about the Duchess?" I looked down at the glinting silver frame of my commuting bike, gliding serenely through the desert air. "The Duchess. I like it." The azure water of the Red Sea slowly faded as the road carved a twisting path into the desert mountains. We had another 20 miles of steady climbing, and then our long day would be over. Despite the endurance, it felt good to turn away and head back into the sand, the pristine soul of the country, where the rules of the market economy didn't seem to apply. We made it into camp and were pleased to note that we were not the last of the riders to arrive. We lay our bikes on the ground, stood and cheered each straggling cyclist in, then celebrated as a group with an enormous pasta dinner. Nate and I stayed up a little late and shared a hot chocolate and the panoramic desert view. In the distance, oil rigs glimmered on the Red Sea, sucking up more natural resources to quench the world's need for fuel. It felt like we were beginning to separate from this world. Our lives a simpler subsistence existence of tents, food, bicycles, and wonder at the beauty of the desert night. The next day, Simon and the Duchess rolled down the desert road to the banks of the River Nile, which we would follow on its life-giving path through the Sahara. Approximately 90% of Egypt's population lived on the banks, making it a stark contrast to the emptiness of the desert. As we rode, we were joined by running children, farmers leading donkeys, and trucks piled impossibly high with tottering piles of wood and sugarcane. The kids waved and yelled at us. It felt exactly as I'd imagined an Africa cycle ride to be. Yet it was disconcerting at the same time. At lunch, as I wolfed down my usual 5 cheese sandwiches, shabbily dressed children peered at us through the palm trees. They weren't waving and smiling anymore. Nate noticed my concern and gave an understanding nod. We have to eat, don't we? But you feel that these kids are much hungrier than we are. I munched away without offering much in response. As an openly gay man, Nate was perhaps more conscious of social inequality than I was, or at least able to vocalise it. I felt nothing but ignorance and guilt. We finished our lunch and cycled away in silence, the children from the village watching us through the trees. The next stop was Luxor, and we visited Karnak, the temple of Queen Hatshepsut, and the Valley of the Kings. Nate took a hot air balloon trip, ever the adventurer, while I walked around feeling mild unease as a resident of the UK, seeing the occasional missing head or plinth, and knowing that it sat in prime position in the British Museum. Would this be the same for the whole trip, as I stole elements of Africa from my own stories or photo album back home? What did I hope this continent was going to give me? Was I a thief or a donor? The answers were not forthcoming. As the days wore on, the heat of the afternoon started to increase, and an afternoon Coke stop became invaluable. I would never consume fizzy drinks at home, but in a tiny Saharan village, Coca-Cola was pretty much the only cold product available. At the end of most days, I felt like passing out, but distracted myself by listening to Nate conversing with other riders about subjects such as gay rights in America, the death penalty, and the recent history of Egypt. His studious oratory challenged me to think about where I was and what the trip meant in the wider context of the continent. But the effort of the cycling meant I found limited coherent answers. Only sleep. We took a day's rest in Aswan and visited the bazaars and mosques. The bustling streets, exotic spices and street hawkers ticked all my North African expectation boxes, and yet filled me with a certain emptiness. The hawkers eyed us with suspicion. The bars were quiet, and even the feluccas lay bobbing, unused, against the bank of the Nile. There were clues in snatches of conversation. The government are driving away tourists. The dam has damaged the water. There is no work for people. I bought a good set of souvenirs and local shawarma. It seemed like all that a tourist could do. Rested, re-energised, and still questioning, we cycled along the long desert road to Lake Nasser, the gateway to the old Nubian Empire. The vast temple of Abu Simbel loomed in the distance. 4 colossal statues of Ramses II, carved out of the rock, overlooking the lake with the overwhelming strength of Egypt and its kingdom. The temples were beautifully preserved, carvings and hieroglyphics almost intact from their creation in around 1200 BC. The next morning, Nate and I rose early and headed to the temple for sunrise. I readied my camera while Nate stood with his hands behind his back, contemplating the scene. As the rays of orange light shone over the gargantuan stone pharaohs, Nate spoke softly to himself. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Nate turned and gave me a half smile. But don't despair, Ozymandias. No power lasts forever, and the sun may rise on a world even more beautiful than the one on which it's set. We turned and walked slowly away and looked for some breakfast.